Our next panel will be led by our moderator, Rachel Lowenstein. She has been selected as one of Ad Age's 2023 40 Under 40 honorees for her groundbreaking work in fostering neurodiversity. She has also accomplished this through her mindshare work. She is sharing the stage with our distinguished panelists. But first, please come on up, Rachel. We have Christine Emba from the Washington Post, Richard Reeves, American Institute for Boys and Men, Michelle Terry, CEO of Movember, and Joshua Hughes, Howard University student.
Hello, everybody. I knew it was going to be a tough act to follow Rupi, but I don't think I was emotionally prepared to get on stage right after that beautiful performance. So thank you so much, Rupi. It was stunning. So this conversation about masculinity and culture is something that we've been driving through the Unstereotype Alliance with some of the work that I've been doing with them. The Unstereotype Alliance, if you aren't aware, is a collective of over 240 organizations convened by UN Women that seeks to eradicate harmful stereotypes in advertising and media to drive social change. Now, this conversation about masculinity, I personally think, is one of the most urgent conversations that we need to have in culture right now because it implicates a lot of the challenges that we are facing. So to do that, I'm first going to do a little bit of a setup where I'm going to talk about the Spice Girls, which I'm sure you were not expecting, but stick with me because I do have a point. If you can't tell, that's me as a kid, and that's my big brother, Ben. Ben and I were best friends growing up. I have like this very core memory of us in 1997 where he decided to buy us the first Spice Girls CD, which frankly changed me forever. And when Ben bought us that CD, it happened to coincide at a time where the internet was confined to us hogging our parents' phone lines with AOL chat rooms. And as time went on and life changed, the Spice Girls broke up and the internet changed too. It changed a lot, particularly for Ben and his peers, and we would see that today in 2023, that across many cultural lines, men are not doing okay in society today. We're seeing sharp declines in enrollment amongst men. There's no shortage of cultural pundits talking about the loneliness epidemic that young men are facing. The gun violence that continues to happen in this country in particular that unfortunately is almost universally enacted by cisgender men, and directly at odds with HeForShe's mission, for the first time in modern history, gender equity is now, the concept of gender equity is now actively regressing amongst young men. Now, these ideas that are beginning to become more prevalent in culture, specifically around misogyny, are closely linked to this idea of disenfranchisement that is happening with young men. And according to experts, this disenfranchisement makes them particularly vulnerable to radicalization. And this is largely happening through a massive global digital ecosystem called the manosphere, which is made up of numerous subcultures like incels or red pill. And they don't have a unifying idea, but they do have some unifying beliefs. And those include that feminism is the cause of men's pain, and that there is a singular way to be a man in culture today. And because of the cultural silence that has existed around masculinity up until pretty recently, this has made it very easy for figures in the manosphere to package up a very singular idea about masculinity to young men. And for me, this is not an exploration, this is a reflection. Ben was an early entrant into red pill spaces, and while he eventually got out of the pipeline, for over a decade, it destroyed our relationship. Now, these ideas that are being perpetuated in some of these spaces that make it very alluring to young men like my brother are exploiting some of the anxieties that young men have in culture based off of these very antiquated standards that men have to live up to. And I think a very simple demonstration of what I mean by this is today, if you ask women, what does womanhood mean to you? Every single woman is going to give you a very different and a very valid answer, but I'm not sure that posing the same question to men about what masculinity means to them would yield such diverse responses. And these monolithic standards about masculinity are linked to making men more depressed, more violent, and more likely to take their own lives. So we have an enormous responsibility to break this cultural ultimatum that I believe we have constructed from offering either just a pipeline that is going to profit off of men's pain, or they can just settle for culture and media that is ignoring the crisis that they're going through altogether. Because lies will defeat silence every time, and that has brought us into this issue that we are facing in society today. Now, my panelists are going to talk about what it means to break this cultural ultimatum and what the future of advocacy for young men and boys needs to look like. I will leave you with one very final thought from me. There is no singular future of masculinity that one person can build, but what I can say is that after being a guy who was lured into manosphere spaces, Ben eventually returned to being the guy who wanted to have a dance party with his kid sister to the Spice Girls, and that feels like a pretty good guy to me. So now over to my incredible esteemed panelists. I'll do very quick introductions before we dive into the conversation. We have Christine Enba, who is a columnist and editor at The Washington Post, where she explores things like ideas, culture, and society. We have Richard Reeves from the American Institute for Boys and Men, who is quite the esteemed thinker in this space, having written a pretty well-regarded book on this topic of boys and men. We have Michelle Terry, who is the CEO of Movember, the leading men's health charity on a mission to step change men's mental health. And finally, but certainly not least, we have Joshua Hughes, who is a student at Howard University majoring in mathematics and is quite the impressive leader at his young age with his involvement in numerous NGOs. So first, I would love to start with you, Christine. You wrote one of the most widely read columns on Washington Post recently about masculinity and culture. I would love to hear from you some of your reflections that you have from that article and some of the observations that you've made about the singular standard of masculinity that is being perpetuated today.
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, I'll just state that the title of that essay was Men Are Lost. Not to put too fine a point of it, but it was in many ways an illustration of exactly the story that you describe. I went out and spoke to a lot of young men in researching this quite long essay, and I heard over and over again a sense of confusion. One college student in particular stood out to me. I was asking him what masculinity meant to him, what he thought about being a man, and he said, "To be honest, I don't know what it means. And I feel like the men around me, they don't really know how to be." And this is happening for a lot of reasons, let's be clear. First of all, good ones. Society has shifted over the past half century. Women have broken down barriers and surged ahead. They're earning more, they're in the workplace, they're at colleges. In fact, if you look at college enrollment, now women achieve 100 bachelor's degrees, at least in the US, for every 74 that men do. And in the drop in college enrollment here, that's 70% men. It's led by men falling behind. But at the same time, as you pointed out, there isn't a real new model of what masculinity looks like. Now that men don't necessarily see themselves only fulfilling the roles of provider and protector, only seeing themselves succeeding, but yes, having to compete with their female classmates, there's a sense that they don't really know how to be. They're not good examples for what a modern masculinity looks like. At least that's what they think. And so they end up turning to the manosphere, to these manfluencers, as I call them. If you speak to any primary or secondary school teacher, for instance, you've, I'm sure, heard about Andrew Tate, who performs this vision of masculinity that's about buying expensive cars and literally abusing women. Unfortunately, though, because of the lack of other options, these influencers are having an effect, and we're seeing that statistically. So the global firm Ipsos conducted a survey this year on International Women's Day, which found that globally, more than half of citizens say that the push for gender equality has gone far enough in their country. And nearly half of them say that, in fact, efforts to help women achieve are now being used to discriminate against men. In essence, that women are pushing men back. And surprisingly, the numbers here in this survey are actually higher for younger men, for millennials and Gen Z. than they are even for older generations. Something is going wrong here. These numbers have also risen in just the past 5 years. One thing that I think we have to make clear is that women's success does not and should not come at the expense of men. The sexes have to and will rise and fall together. Women can succeed and men can succeed too. And a vision of masculinity that's based on degrading women, denouncing femininity, is not a masculinity that's the way forward.
Thank you so much, Christine. Richard, I would love to hear your perspective on this topic. I think some of the points that Christine raised are really critical for us to dive in further. And in your book of Boys and Men, you talk a lot about the disenfranchisement and the disillusionment that young men are facing. Can you expand on some of Christine's insights based off of your own analysis?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the invitation. I think I might be respectfully disruptive in the next few things I say. As a lifelong, ardent feminist, I have decided to create an institute focused on the problems of boys and men. That needs a bit of explanation. It's based on a few assumptions. It's based on assumption number one, and Christine has already referred to this, that in a number of countries in the world, and it's very important to be specific when we're talking about these issues, there are a number of gender gaps that now run in ways that go against the traditional narrative of gender equality. So in suicide, and I'm sure Michelle will talk about that, in education, in some other areas, wage stagnation, we're really seeing some problems, real problems for men, especially in the US, black boys and men, and those from working class backgrounds. So real problems. The second assumption is, and this really builds on both your points, Rachel, which is that, and Christine's points, that if there are real problems in a society faced by a group and they don't see and hear those problems being addressed directly by mainstream institutions, they can turn into grievances. And grievances are weaponized by the manfluencers, to use Christine's term, or even people at the ballot box. And so I think we have a responsibility to take those problems seriously. And the final assumption is that we can, as we continue to do the necessary work for women and girls, also do the work that is increasingly clear we need to do for boys and men, that we can think two thoughts at once. We can do two things at once. And we have to make men, young men especially, feel like gender equality, gender equity, and feminism are also things that are for them. And that we're not only asking them to be good allies, which we should. We're not only asking them to examine their own prejudices, which we should, but we're also working for them. Because if young men feel like we're not working for them, we're not speaking for them, they'll go find someone who they think is. And as Christine's work shows, we may not like who that person is. If not us, who?
I think everything that you're saying, Richard, is spot on and respectively disruptive in the right direction. You know, Bell Hooks said in her book about masculinity and feminism that one of the challenges of feminism is that it's oftentimes not created the right forms or enough space for men to be involved in advocacy around gender equity. So I couldn't agree more with everything that you're saying. Joshua, we are so honored to have you here and hear your thoughts as a student and as a leader in your own right. I'd love to hear, based off of your lived experience, your expertise, some of your thoughts that Christine and Richard are posing here.
Yes, definitely. And I first want to start by saying thank you so much for the invitation to this amazing event. We need more events like this in order to really push these agendas forward. And in discussing the amazing research of Christine, the first thing that I think of when you think of gender equality is collaboration and community. As a future educator, I'm very aware that we as people, we learn from experiences, whether they be lived experiences or experiences that are shared from other people. And as a student that's attending the illustrious Howard University, the dynamic there is a little bit different because the women are actually the leaders of our campus. There's actually a 72% women enrollment compared to a 28% of males. So with women being the majority there, it's very important for us to learn from their perspectives, learn what they need, and be able to come together into these collaborative spaces to not only identify the problem and identify where our personal perspectives may differ, but to also identify where we can come together. And one quote that definitely lives with me is that we can move fast alone, but we can definitely move farther together.
Thank you so much, Joshua. Michelle, you are the CEO of Movember, which is such a leader in the space around men's health in general, but has a particular focus around men's mental health. And through the Unstereotype Alliance, I've been very lucky enough to be working with some of your colleagues on the role of the private sector in changing media's representation of men and their challenges around mental health. I'd love to hear your perspective based off of some of the research that y'all have done and the insights that you have about the state of men's mental health today, and in particular, maybe the role of media that is perpetuating some of these issues.
Yeah, thank you so much. And first of all, I just wanted to acknowledge, I feel so honoured to be amongst you, all of you on the stage here, and Rupa, your beautiful, eloquent, emotional poem, which really just encapsulates the why and the feeling behind the work that we do. So thank you. So, Rachel, we know from OECD statistics in 2018 that men are 3 to 4 times more likely to die than women by suicide. And it might seem quite extreme that I start talking in a mental health discussion and immediately go to suicide, but I've been struck by something that Richard has previously pointed out recently, that the Centre for Disease Control here in the United States does not report on suicide being disproportionately a problem that is suffered by men. And, you know, to me that seems a little odd, given the statistics that we heard reported from the OECD. And at Movember, we believe that we have to think that this in a gendered way in order to think about what works to address the problem. So I think you know, we should contemplate that. And we know that beyond suicide as well, men are overrepresented in risky behaviours that lead to harm, so tobacco, alcohol use, occupational risks, etc. And I think resonantly to some of the points that Christine was making, beyond these deaths of despair are economic and social changes over the last 40 years that have left men feeling lonely, feeling isolated, families lacking support, and women and communities really left to pick up the pieces, especially in those poor areas. And I think the other thing to think about is that for decades, mental health interventions have focused mostly on the individual to try and say, how can we give men the tools and support they need to cope with life's challenges as they get thrown at them across different points of life? But what's become clear is that placing the responsibility solely on the shoulders of men to create those structural and cultural changes, it simply won't work alone. We need to think in terms of how can we influence behaviours, systems and norms, and how they work together in intersection. So our vision is a world where men recognise when they need help, they know how and where to get help, and they get the support that really hits the mark. And thinking about systems and the ways that men interact, in Australia we have an example. Only 1 in 5 people who seek talking therapy are men. Therapists are now disproportionately women, and of those men who do enter therapy, about 45% drop out prematurely. So we've developed a gender-responsive healthcare program in conjunction with our federal government called Men in Mind, and what that's intending to do, it's building an evidence base and training clinicians of how to engage confidently and with the right skills to connect with men when they're in distress so they get the best possible treatment. And we're starting to think, how can that be extended out to other interested groups, people like the police force who interact with men in distress. So there's also the community, and this is probably one of the most important and powerful ways that we can connect with men. So we've been investing for over 15 years in community intervention, and it's going where men are. It's thinking about the sports club, the gym. It's thinking about online. It's thinking about representation in the media and how men connect in the online space or the gaming space. So we've created a pretty robust evidence base. And what we're trying to do is design and then work with lots of other people to scale programs that can meet men where they are. And then possibly a little bit of a shameless plug for Movember, and we are the people who are responsible for some pretty questionable facial hair in the month formerly known as November, now Movember. But there's change in the broader cultural environment that can be made. Our movement started 20 years ago in a pub in Melbourne, but since then we've enrolled millions of supporters around the world who've raised funds for men's health, but I think much more importantly have raised awareness of the importance of the health of men and boys in creating a healthier world, and started conversations. And we know that men who have awareness of this are more likely to seek help when they need it, twice as likely, and also twice as likely to spot signs in others and provide help as needed.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Christine, I want to dive actually into something that Michelle posed, which is that the conversation about masculinity and the struggles that men are facing has been posed as this individual failure of men, but as Michelle talked about, it's very systemic, it's cultural, it's embedded in society. I think knowing that we have a pretty firm grasp of the challenges today, from your perspective, what needs to happen next to address these root issues? What are these solutions that we need to give to young men and boys to model more positive demonstrations of masculinity while addressing some of these root causes that are having a halo effect with misogyny, with racism, with other forms of oppression?
That's an excellent question. I mean, I think we've already identified some really clear things just in this panel. I mean, first, what I've heard from, I think, every panelist is the idea of specificity. So we need to talk about men in the context of masculinity, in the context of their systems and communities, not just talk about women and say, well, men should support them. That's what men should do. We have to be able to speak directly to men. And we also need to speak positively in some ways, in many ways, I would say. We've had a lot of discussion over the past several years in our discourse about toxic masculinity, the things that men have done wrong, how men are holding women back. But that's a very negative vision. And negative visions tend not to be the ones that inspire. If we want men to do better, to be better allies, we have to provide a positive vision for what men can be that's also specific to the lived reality of being a man. That means not just saying, well, be more like your sister, or, well, just support women in your community, but nothing to the men themselves. What does a good man look like, and can we talk about that? And when we do talk about that, we need to be open to a broader vision of masculinity. So when I wrote my essay, I did a follow-up piece asking readers to just write in and tell me who their ideal of masculinity was, who an ideal man could be. And the responses were fantastic. I mean, it was everyone from Mr. Rogers to LeBron James to Aristotle to Captain Kirk. You don't have to be the Lone Ranger. You don't have to be a professional soccer player. You definitely don't have to be a misogynist like Andrew Tate. There are many, many visions of what a good man can be. We can present those and celebrate them, and that's far more attractive than just casting blame.
Very well said. So, Richard, I think building on what Christine is saying, I think I know the answer to this, but do we need to advocate for men? And if so, what does that look like?
I do think we need to advocate for boys and men when the data suggests that there are areas where they're struggling, and the evidence is quite strong, without in any way giving up the advocacy that remains necessary for women and girls. But this issue of how to be as well as how not to be, right? This story of like We don't want you to be like this. We don't want you to do that. But then what do we want you to do? This positive vision. I think that that's best answered with real people in real life rather than online. As a general proposition, boys and young men, in fact, everybody believes their eyes before they believe their ears. And so one of the many things I love about Joshua is that he's going to be an educator, right? That makes him a minority in the US, for sure, because we have seen the share of teachers in the US who are male drop from 33% when Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980 to 23% today and falling. We have halved the share of men in social work and psychology. Among psychologists under the age of 30 in the US, only 5% are male. And so all of the work we're doing to promote women into traditionally male professions and occupations is absolutely necessary. Where is the equivalent work to at least arrest the decline in the share of men in our classrooms, in psychotherapy, in the mental health profession? And I don't see it at all. So there's an advocacy point for you, which, by the way, I think is a deeply feminist claim. But I don't hear almost anybody talking about it because the Andrew Tates of this world and the misogynist right, they don't care about that stuff. But too often, it feels like more progressively inclined organizations are also not taking up those issues. That creates a vacuum, and the internet abhors a vacuum. Someone's filling it. Back to what I said earlier, we need to be filling that vacuum rather than leaving it vacant for the manosphere.
Thank you very much, Richard. So I'd like to close with a quick rapid fire to each of our panelists, being very mindful of time, so maybe just in a couple of sentences, starting first with you, Joshua, and then going down the line. What is one message that you want young men who are watching today to take away from today's discussion on how they can respectfully disrupt the conversation about masculinity and better build more positive models for each other and better support each other in the future?
Thank you. That's an amazing question. The initial word that comes to mind is a word that Richard shared earlier, which is interpretation. Very similarly to the poetry shared by Ms. Rupi Kaur or the poetry shared by our panelist earlier, I believe that life is full of a collection of metaphors, and we really have to look at these abstractly in order to really understand different perspectives. And so being able to understand the perspective of a woman, being able to understand the perspective of a man, being able to share these perspectives is really the first step in being able to make any disruptive, respectful change.
Thank you very much, Joshua. Michelle?
I hope if there's one thing that you take away from this discussion is that, I think all of us are feminists. All of us want a better world. But it's the importance of recognizing and thinking and investing in men's health. Because we know that healthier men lead to healthier societies and ultimately a better world. And ultimately a world that's going to support equality for women. So with happier and healthier men, families go stronger, relationships are better, communities prosper, and we are all better off.
Thank you, Michelle. Richard?
It's not a zero-sum game. We have to do both things at once. And if people don't feel like the women's movement is a movement for humanity and for boys and men and for us all, to echo Christine, unless men feel like we're rising together, then we're going to lose more and more of them. And I really feel like an initiative like this is at a pivot point, and that we've got to move into that space confidently and positively to make sure that our young men feel included in this conversation.
Well said. Christine?
I mean, I would almost echo that final point. We have to remember that this isn't a zero-sum game, that the sexes do rise and fall together. We want to support women, but women also have men and boys in their lives, their fathers, their husbands, their friends, their partners, who they love and they want to succeed. And we can't succeed without each other.
Very well said. Thank you, Christine. So I will close just by saying I hope all of you are as energized as I am by this discussion. We have so much work to do when it comes to young men and boys, and as our panelists said, this is not a zero-sum game. We need to be working together in service of gender equity for all. So thank you so much, HeForShe, and thank you so much to my fellow panelists.